think about that, you take a step back, and I go to, it was Boston. I forget which hospital group in Boston. Then they had ransomware, and they had to call it the National Guard. And the National Guard was helping them re-image the computers.
I don't even remember that one.
Okay, so this was, I'm trying to date it in years. Everything like blurs together. There was, but you know, it was like ransomware. It had been around long enough that like people, you know, you should like know what was going on. And then they got into this thing where they had to re-image all of the computers, all the devices in order to get back on. And they didn't have the staff. And so they literally had National Guard. I mean, like fatigue wearing National Guard in the hospital with boot drives, like helping them re-image the systems.
Well, that's, hope is not a strategy, right? At that point, you're looking at a bad situation. I guess they're not paying the ransomware, right? And so,
what do you think? I mean, what percentage of people actually pay? This is one of those like big no-nos that people don't talk about, but it feels like it's going to be a lot higher than people want to accept.
well, I think if they pay, they don't want to disclose that, because what happens is if you pay, I mean, if you really think about the bad guys, okay, getting into the network, it's usually something innocent, a phishing email or
100% all the time.
a vulnerability that they're exploited. They get in, grab hold of it, map out the network. I always kind of, joke around and say, hey, if you do pay the ransomware, make sure you get a map of your network, because they have a very good one, right? And they know where everything is hidden. And they've also put back doors in. And then if you do pay, they recognize you as a paying entity. And so it's really, do they have a back door that is going to be there for a long time, forever? Yeah. And so then if they need to get in or they sell access to it, will you pay again?
I remember reading, I think this must have been like the DVR like 2 years ago, and it was showing a stat all of a sudden of dwell time just going to almost zero, where we had prior to that dwell time at like 200 days, and all of a sudden dwell time is like hours. In some case, even the compression was so extreme. You're like, oh, this is good. People are detecting this stuff faster, and it's like, it's not just resonating and networking. And then you have this moment of, oh, no, that's actually really bad. We've gotten really good at commercializing these things.
Yeah, that whole dwell time, I remember following it. It's got like 65 days, and people thought, this is great.
Yeah, right. Like, no, this is not good.
It's bad. And what happens is they actually now, it's a whole business, right? So the guys who sell access isolate themselves from the guys who actually do the reconnaissance and take the data out, and then they can actually segregate the guys that, hey, okay, now we're ready to do the ransom. And so there's this, business set up to isolate everybody from being prosecuted 100%, right? Hey, I just sold access. I didn't do any of the malware or damage. So there's this whole phase thing. So even if you do get ransom, what happened before?
One of the things I don't like about the industry is becoming this like, when I say industry, I'm talking about like this shift between like IT and security experts and like the rank and file users. We're at a position now where it's like, you are going to have this, payloads, email, like click on the link, malicious stuff, like all this stuff. It's too sophisticated. Even your sophisticated users, people, crypto experts, are getting fished, right? Like it's, And when I say it, crypto experts, people with like huge wallets, that, are getting exploits. And these are savvy people, right? I'm kind of curious because, and this will go up in a tangent here a little bit, but I like mentally compartmentalize like, defensive versus offensive capabilities in your security stack. And, we could talk about the CSF framework and, the 5 pillars and where you fit into one of these 5 pillars. But a lot of this, of what gets installed or what gets pushed, is defensive. It's not necessarily offensive. And, I wouldn't say like an EDR is an offensive technology, right? Like it's there to help identify stuff that's happening to you. And then, of course, feed signals into something else, which then can take and correlate a lot of signals and give you a better, heuristic of the entire environment. When you talk about like email exploits or phishing attacks, and I start, it's like, what's the line between maintaining more like a defensive posture versus really investing in things like RBI and doing browser inspection and exploiting payloads and trying to see what's actually going to run and how, it's like, should we be investing more in the offensive side at this point?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a market coming out, okay, we'll go actively pen test your environment the whole time, and it's still going to find holes. And you look at the funding of the guys who are setting this up, they can go buy all those tools as well. That's the challenge. So they know what it picks up, what it doesn't. If you really look at kind of the big threat, it's companies like, for example, CrowdStrike. If I have your source code and your bug list, I know how to get around that. So even if you deploy everything that you think, hey, it's going to go, you're right. It's a matter of time before something clicks and gets in and they can move around. if you're going on the offensive, you're only as good as what you know at that point, right? So it's like pen testing. The pen testers know what they know, but what they don't see is, hey, this over here is exposed, right? Because they're not aware of it. So I think it's hard to say, we're not really in the offensive part, right? We're looking at things just like you say, as they come in real time, correlating that stuff and responding as quickly as we can.
Offensive probably isn't the right terminology, right? But, I don't want to say like creating, I think the big misnomer I see a lot when we're talking with companies is this idea of like, oh, we're not a target, right? Like, oh, we're not a target. And the answer to that is like, nobody's really a target. Like the only real targets are maybe banks, government installations, maybe you talk about manufacturing, real intellectual property that some nation state is trying to exfiltrate from you, right? But like, what's your formula for concrete? That's important. But everybody else, it's not like, oh, we're not a target. It's like, no, you're connected to the internet. Like you don't get to choose anymore.
Yeah, well, that is true. And when they say that, I kind of say, well, you have to understand how the business works. So I can go online today, rent my phishing email and the software, put it out to 1,000 people. I'm just going to use, round numbers. I come back in the morning and I have 20, 25 computers that I own. And then now I look at, where am I? Am I in a bank? And am I in a, hospital? Am I in a small manufacturing one, right? And there's different values, I think, to them put on that. But now their mission is to get in and figure that out. And once they've got that, they, just like I was talking about earlier, sell access to that and those have value. And it's that simple, right? So once you're exposed and the chink in the armor is there and they have access to a node on your network, that's when they can start pivoting around, and you better be able to find that stuff fast or else, right? And so then the ones who say I'm not a target, they just look the other way until something happens, right? We've had folks come to us, hospitals, clinics that are really big and surprisingly big, and we talked to them about what we do and how companies, and they said, well, I think all we need is a penetration test. And then they call back 6 months later, hey, all of my servers are down. The data center is locked up with ransomware. Can you help? And I jokingly to myself say, I think you failed the pen test. And the reality is at that point, they have to figure it out. And that's where it gets down to, just like this, they had to look at what they had for backups. They had gotten to the backups because there was no detection. There was no real EDR. It was just the, old school antivirus signature type model, and no EDR in place to see the processes, no ability to see if anything's moving around. So they got into the backups, infected those, encrypted those. The grace that they had was they had one machine that wasn't turned on in the back of the room that had some of their data, most of the database. So they actually made the choice not to pay the ransom, but rebuild everything from bare metal and then restore and then type in the rest. So the event was somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 million in expense, right? Now that's versus paying the ransom. But that's the risk you run when you say, I'm not a target. No one's coming after my stuff. Like you said, it doesn't matter where they are. If I can get between you and what makes your company run, will you pay?
I've been asking a variation of this question for maybe 10 years now. And the source of the question was, how do you sell cybersecurity to somebody who's not buying cybersecurity, right? And the common answer to that one was like, oh, it basically folds into like an education or like a FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt, kind of track. And neither will really work, right? And that example, and I've seen this over and over again with organizations are going out and somebody inside the organization is advocating, like, let's go get this, let's get an, EDR, let's get a this, let's get a that, and improve our posture. And it gets to some point in a budget cycle, or approval cycle, and somebody says, no, we're not going to spend the money on it. We don't need to. We're not a target. We don't have risk. We can't another budget for this thing, right? Which are like basic business decisions at that point. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that a lot of this is because IT cycles are so ingrained into, return on investment and TCO. And like, how do you actually quantify what is your return on investment on an MDR service? Right? Like, what is your ROI on MDR? And then people tell me it's an insurance policy. Well, it's not really an insurance policy. Insurance pays you when your house burns down. Like, your house burns down, they pay you to build a new house. And that's also not what anything inside the MDR stack really does for you. So then it was, okay, well, maybe insurance is going to push this and force. And we see insurance agencies and carriers starting to push more and more posture. That pen test was probably, they had an insurance requirement. Somebody said, you have to have a pen test. They said, okay, let's go get one. And so what I've kind of come to what I've been wondering about is it's just scar tissue. Like, do we have to have enough houses burned down, figuratively speaking, before people start to understand, like, I have to do something a little different here? And now I'm a relative, I mean, I don't do this solely, right? I'm kind of curious for somebody who's on the inside of this, like the sales cycle around MDR services is either somebody calls you and we've had this incident, somebody calls you and says, we want to buy this. What do you think is going to happen here? How does this evolve?
I mean, there's so much to unpack there, right? Like
A ton.
Really, like
It's an open-ended question, so you can take it.
I mean, we could be here for an hour.
Perfect. Let's do it.
The reality of that is that the cybersecurity stuff, it's like the news, right? What's the latest gets run for a while and then it goes away. So people forget, right? So the board now, everybody at some point, if you look, will have somebody on there that cares about cybersecurity. The private equity businesses, hey, I'm the investor. I gave you $1 million. I gave you $1 million. I gave you $1 million. Well, what are you doing to protect my investment? So then that level is pushing down security to places that it would have never gotten to before, which is good, right? Because those guys are going, hey, I bake bread. I cyber what? But then the guy's like, hey, if you're baking the bread and the machines go down, you're no longer baking bread. And then where are we as a company? So when you look at that, if they're not buying, right, it has to be something that kind of, hey, don't touch that, it's hot. And then they touch it, and then they realize, hey, okay, I might need something here. The budget cycle is an interesting thing because folks who haven't spent money on it in the past will tend to say, okay, I maybe need this, and then they see something happen to their friends, or they hear something, and then they start to like look at it. And MDR, it's kind of like insurance because if something happens, when it does, someone is there to support you, right? So the goal is, hey, I need to stop this as quickly as I can and contain the threat to recover my business, right? To make yourself more resilient to what's happening in the environment. If you don't, the alternative, and we've seen this, companies will go out of business. They just can't recover. They go home. So when you talk about the ROI and the budget and how does that work, I can tell you, I sat there and watched this happen in real time. We were talking to a company about MDR and they had an incident. It was a pretty small one. It was a business email compromise. They'd gotten to a couple things, sent some emails around. I don't know the exact details, buy me gift cards, right? So it raised the threat to the IT director level, and they brought us in and a couple other vendors and talked to us about what we're doing. And we said, yeah, here's how you can benefit from a service like us. Here's how we would have helped you detect that quickly, stop it, and, contain it. And we gave them a quote for, I think it was around, I'll just use round numbers, about $75,000 for the whole year for our services. And they decided to do nothing. They actually bought a piece of technology. So then fast forward, just like that, I don't know the exact time frame. It wasn't too long. We were back in front of them. This time, the mood was much different. They had gotten some ransomware in the environment, and we're in the room with the IT folks and the CEO. So the CEO is listening in to our pitch, and he says, weren't you guys here before? Kind of question, like, why are we doing this? And the sales guy, very interesting question. He said, so what do you do for a business? And they basically manage mineral rights. So something not sexy. That's not sexy unless you're in the business, right? Then it's super sexy.
Of course.
But to the average person, to me and you, managing mineral rights means what? I think he's got a database of people and then checks that, right, when people ask. He said, how much does it cost you if your business were to go down for 2 weeks and you couldn't do anything? And he sat there for a good couple minutes, and you can see the math happening, right? And he said, it's about at least $1.5 million in revenue I lose. And he goes, so you help me protect from going down for a long period of time. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly what we do. And he looked at the IT guys and said, how much does this cost? And he said, about $75,000 a year. And he goes, why are we still talking about this? Let's go. Let's get it done. And the contract was signed the next day. So it's quantifying that for someone who really hasn't thought about it that way is what it sometimes takes, right? Like the guy who's running the business says, if I go down, and there's a good possibility because the reason we're at the table for the second time is because he was down. Now, Ren, small bullet wound, right? I think good. I'm not the whole company. So they were doing some things right. That's really, I think, what has to happen is if you can quantify, if I were to lose my business for a period of time, lose access to my data, lose access to something, or lose my IP completely. What happens to my business?
Well, in that example, you had a dose of reality that it had to hit, right? Because when we start talking about any sort of evaluation based on risk, you say, okay, if you're down for 2 weeks, it's $1.5 million. And what is the likelihood that you're going to be down for 2 weeks? And for people that haven't had that experience of being down for 2 weeks, the likelihood of being down for 2 weeks is very low, right? So you can quantify the risk and say it's $1.5 billion of lost revenue for you. But if the perception of risk is zero, why spend any money to resolve that? It's like, I don't need insurance for like, an asteroid hitting me, right? Or a meteorite coming down and hitting my building, right? Like, well, and even then, the likelihood of risk is really low, right? Yeah. So private equity example that you gave is interesting because when you look at it, you say, okay, across a portfolio of investment for a fund or for a business, how much does it take before this becomes an event, right? So if you've got 50 investments, 100 investments, 200 investments, statistically within that base of investment, you're going to have a bad experience. And then you take a step back and you say, okay, now we have to quantify this risk across our entire portfolio. And what does this actually mean for us in terms of our investor dollars that we have at stake? And then it probably becomes reasonable, right? Like very quickly you look at it, you take a step back and you say, whoa, this isn't great.
Well, it's a matter of if you're putting that money in, and I talk about this, and I think you do too, it's balancing the risk with the budget. Don't matter what you do. I can do everything under the sun, I still have risk. Well, how much dollars do I spend to mitigate and take out risk, right? So if you look at it in terms of the MDR market is a perfect market for outsource. The problems solved are I can't have the people sitting there, let's just call it looking at my EDR, looking at my logs all day. I can't afford that, most companies, unless I can build my own security operations center and I'm going to invest money to have a lot of money. I can tell you it's more than most will invest. They're not in cybersecurity as a business. They're in the business of X, mineral rights, baking bread, whatever it is. And then if you invest all of that money into doing your own SOC and your own stuff, you only know about your own environment. You don't see the other stuff. So then you have this kind of as a service model that has come where I have visibility across finance, legal, entertainment, all these industries, and I can take that intelligence and apply it to your business. There's a huge advantage. I'm paying a fraction of the cost. I'm getting the threat intel. I'm getting the real-time response. 24/7, I mean, if you look at what it costs to employ a cybersecurity guy, because the way of the world is, in the past, IT, right, this is how it worked. We need security. So they bought a firewall. And who gets to deploy the firewall? Well, it's IT. And IT doesn't know a lot about security unless you got a curious guy. So they stand it up and go, lights are blinking, everything's on, I've allowed what I think I need to allow, and I've blocked what I think I need to block. And then that's it, check. So now the security guys, it's evolved, right, really. I mean, I came from the world where I saw it both ways. I remember the transition for myself going, well, yeah, just because it's up doesn't mean it's doing what it's supposed to. And then you look at the security aspect of it, and it really takes a skill set. So now some of the guys are transitioning over. They're becoming CISOs. They're becoming interested in cyber. Heck, it's really a growing space, and IT is kind of, it's still there.
It's not sexy.
Yeah, it's not like I'm going to make $1 million somehow. But the cybersecurity folks are now saying, hey, you need these tools. So back to what I was saying, is if I hire a guy, he still needs the tools. He's not going to be there 24/7. He's not going to not take vacation. He's got a family. Let's just call it what it is. He's got a life where the services run around the clock, right? We went and saw a customer, and it was interesting because we sat there and talked to him, and they listened to the whole thing and said, well, we have a guy who does that, and he looks at all of our logs and all of our stuff. And we looked at each other, and there's a room of people, and we're like, where's the guy? And they said he goes to Thailand every February for 2 weeks. So do you think he posts on Facebook or Instagram? Do you think that other people may know that he's not watching your stuff for 2 weeks in February, and that might be the time things happen? No, never happened that way.
The position that we sit in, we end up talking to and evaluating a lot of service providers for our clients. I mean, this is even before they get in front of a client, right? Just for portfolio access with us. And what you're alluding to, it's 7 bodies for one 24/7 shift, like one shift to 7 people. So I have the same thing with service providers. You see all these MSPs, and it's usually, I don't want to say mom and pop, like it's derogatory. I worked for a mom and pop MSP when I started, and we had 12 engineers and, half a dozen people in sales and account management, and we did phenomenal work. But you think about that in terms of like, there was nobody on call. That MSP is not equipped to then go out and say, hey, we're a 24/7 cyber center that provides SOC service to you. And I'm seeing lots of businesses push into the MDR space as a way to add additional recurring revenue, because now it's like, hey, we can, and it's usually attached to a firewall OEM, right? Hey, we're going to be Palo Cortex, we're going to do the Fortinet, the FortiEDR and FortiSIEM platform, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and we can offer this service to you. And I get these conversations with my client, and you have the same point where it's like, okay, well, how many people are there SOC? You're like, oh, there's 3 of them. And you're like, okay, great. How does this work, And it feels mostly like just an experience gap of like, oh, they've got the SOC and they're cheaper than the next people, so like, why wouldn't we use them? It's like, well, it's not just having the SOC. You have to have a pipeline to talent. You have to have a training program. You have to have advancement. You have to have a career path. You have to have scale. Like you have to have all these different things in order to do this very well.
We talk about it sometimes, mostly internally, but sometimes we talk to the customers. There's a first generation buyer. We talked about the budget. I don't have a budget for this, so I need it. It doesn't matter if it's $1 or if it's $100. It's too much.
Yep.
Okay. So that being said, if I go cheap or maybe a lesser service, but it sounds the same. I did something. It's better than what I was before. And then when that gets kind of rolling and they experience the experience, and then they go, wait a minute, this is really not what I thought I was getting, or they have an incident and then don't recover very well, and then they start to go, okay, now phase 2 kicks in. I have a budget, maybe not enough, but at least I have a budget where I can say, this is what I really want and expect. And a lot of folks end up with a bigger player at that point, a bigger company that has done this very well at that point. Right, and we see it all the time. It's very interesting to be in that position and say, like, hey, we were talking a while ago, and then kind of went away, and then find out they went that route, and then they're back talking to us like, hey, my contract is up, and I need to get serious.
Yeah,
it is an interesting thing, because if you get to that situation, really what you're getting is alerts, and now you've just got 2 emails instead of 1. Okay, I got one from the tech, and I got one from my provider who's telling me the tech said something.
Yep.
So what you really need is someone who can take that stuff in, make sense of it, and then actually do something about it on your behalf before it gets to you. Because if you look at that, if they're relying on just strictly log events,
geez,
I mean, you're driving in the rearview mirror, right? And if it never hits the log, you never saw it. It's all those bad things can happen. If you say, hey, I'm going to see it, and I'm going to send you an email at 3 a.m, that doesn't solve the problem, because then it's too late, right? So anyway, you get down to that. You have to have someone with the ability to take that action, and that's that. You pay for that, right? And I think there's a little thing I saw the other day. I don't know if it was at the airport or not, right? I was at the airport a long time yesterday. And it said, cheap things aren't good and good things aren't cheap.
I mean, it's going to be frustrating. Like, having that where you're at the table the first time, and then, they go a different direction, and they come back to the table the second time because the first day, but there's like, you have to have like a certain sophistication. The buyer has to have experience. They have to have gone through this process. People install, a security tool and then get alert fatigue, right? They don't understand what that really means. And you say, okay, if you're going to get 1,000 alerts per day, how do you actually find the 3 that you actually care about? Because those are the ones that you care about. Like, that's the first one. I have a question that I ask, and the phrasing changes based on whether I'm talking to an IT person or if I'm talking to a, non-IT executive, right? But it's basically, hey, you've got this tool running, right? Yeah. And you like the tool? Yeah, it's working great. And we use it. Okay, great. Show me the folder in Outlook where you're auto-filtering all of the alerts that come out of this thing. And, so the version for the executive is ask your IT person to show you the folder where they're auto-filtering all the alerts. And then it turns into, well, why are we doing that? Well, they have a job, and they have to do their job every day. And their job isn't say they're looking and just reading every single thing that comes into the email, trying to figure out what happens to it. and then to the bigger point, and then they go home at night, right? And they're not on the weekend. And there's plenty of stories about like, oh, things were triggering like crazy, and nobody took action with it.
That's that, like Target did that. No, jeez. They had the tools, they had the fire on stuff.
Yeah.
And every alert or message came as malware, blah, blah, blah. And so they just ignored them. Like you're saying, how do you know?
Mm-hmm. I don't want to say that MDR is passive, but I feel like a lot of like the default is a passive state where it's like, we're going to monitor your environment. We're going to pay attention to your EDR. We're going to do threat intelligence. We're going to do event correlation. We're going to have a SIEM. We're going to take all your signals in, but we're going to tell you like there's something happening, right? And it's not necessarily we're going to take action on something happening. And it feels like companies are finally starting to make this shift in bigger ways of saying, hey, we're looking for an MDR partner that can not only tell us when something bad is happening, but can automatically do things for us when something bad is happening. How much of a shift are you seeing with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right, Max? When we started out, we've been doing this as a company since 2001, right? Let's just look at it in holistic. So cybersecurity wasn't a thing, really.
No.
We were doing a lot of work for guys on Wall Street, financial services. The big company, customer number one, said, hey, you know what? We have all these small networks connected into our environment. They're small companies that can't spell security, even if you spot them a couple word letters, right? So they said, if you can solve this for them, we think there might be something there, and it helps us. So we started out like everybody else with the traditional logging service that we had built ourselves. And the frustrating part was we could see the things happening and they just kept walking by. And then the founder said, hey, you know what? We need to be able to respond. So he built the network kind of piece out, and that did full packet capture. At this point, everything's on the LAN, right? The concept of, I got my laptop and I'm trying to, that didn't exist.
Right.
So we could see everything, and it gave them the ability to actually say, hey, we see this guy here brute forcing in, or this guy clicked on here, we need to stop it immediately. So we were responding way back when. The next piece was integrating EDR, right? So for us, we looked at a bunch of them. We thought, do we build our own? Yeah, we kissed a couple toads along the way. We decided that it really needed to be with someone that is like the incident response tools. And then the business plan became, let's have all the incident response tools rolled out and monitor 24/7 and take action on those. So, we started out with Carbon Black. They were the cat's meow, and now, well, not so much.
Right.
But it gave us the ability, again, to respond very strategically, very surgically, and not just start blocking stuff on the firewall. And it gave us real-time feeds into the environment. So when you say, reactive, I'll give you, that it's not before it happens, right? And I talked to a company at RSA, and they're like, well, we can tell things when they're going to happen before it hits the firewall. And I'm like, so you're selling me this concept of the boogeyman, right? They're out there and they're going to get you. But if it never gets past the firewall, do I care? Right? I don't. If the firewall does its job. So, given that, the guys at Gartner came to us and said, hey, you should be in our MSSP quadrant with guys that do similar stuff. I'm not going to throw company names in there, which I would normally do. And we politely said, we do things differently. And they looked at us and said, what do you mean? I said, well, we actually take action on stuff. So they followed us around for a year and a half and came back and said, you know what, you're right. You do things differently. And based on how you do this, we're going to create a brand new category called Managed Detection and Response, which was awesome for us. Hooray, we got to figure out what we did. And the reason I say that is because we called it active threat protection, collaborative threat hunting. We really didn't know how to sell this, like you were saying, to people who didn't think they needed this. But we knew, right, a long time ago. So then the difference there is Gartner didn't define what the word response means. Mm-hmm. So a response could be, I sent you an email, Max. It's not a very good response, but it's a response. So then now you have a bunch of these organizations saying we do managed detection and response MDR too. Mm-hmm. Just like you said, they're not responding. Or you have to still click the button to respond. Or they're just saying in wonderful words in marketing, we do this. Well, we've been doing this from the get-go. Okay, so is it evolving? Yes. More companies are realizing they have to do some response. So you see now they're tying in to specific vendors, or they have their own. There's a flaw there in that where, hey, I'm running an EDR, I'm running this, I'm feeding in logs, And the only way I can respond is if you have my agent on there. Okay, well, let's just call it what it is. The odds are the ones that's going to get compromised, or they don't have your agent. And you're starting from zero. So if there's more of that happening, there's more people trying to go SOAR, right? And do automation. I don't know that gets it every time. It's simple responses, but where we look at this thing is that we do have that human-led investigation on the back end, and we can make decisions and determinations, because at the end of the day, you're not fighting a computer. There's a human at the other end of that who is controlling this environment.
Yeah, does this for a living.
Yeah. And if you can't figure out where they're doing or what's going on, you're going to miss.
I guess you walk into some situations that are greenfield, right? If you're talking about like a vendor of like, we have the agent and you can run our agent and it's cheaper because we own the agent. We're not licensing it through a third party, right? But, as an organization matures to a certain point or certain size, like there's a lot of stuff that's already there. You get into this thing where you're no longer like looking at a greenfield, you're looking at a game of Tetris, like figuring out, what has to slot into where and what happens. And, you said something earlier about like, oh, we turn it on, the lights are blinking, it's working. I feel like you also described like the majority of companies have went out and purchased D5 security from Microsoft at this point of, oh, we went and we licensed D5 and we're in the cloud, so now we're protected. And there's this whole idea of like, oh, we're, everything's in the cloud, it's with Azure, it's with Microsoft 365, it's with Google Workspace, we're fine. We don't have to worry about this anymore. And you're like, no, that's not exactly accurate anymore, and that was, a relatively also big shift for you guys moving into, Microsoft is the dominant desktop platform, and so when they release a security tool, right, like there's just a certain bundle that happens, and we don't have to talk about antitrust and bundling, we don't have to get into this world, but
probably not.
There is a certain gravity that happens with that where people pull in, and that changed, changed for you as well. Like, okay, now, we need to have a practice area around this, and okay, you want to run Defender as your EDR, and you want to run Sentinel as your SIEM, and you want to run this thing, like we don't care anymore. It's like this. How has that changed things?
Well, I think you look at the budget again, right? So there became this whole word of consolidation. How do we do more with less, or how do we move the spend to a different spot? So Microsoft, obviously a very smart company, and they're looking for more of that market share. They're spending literally millions of dollars on their cyber tools, right? So when we would talk to people in the past, we'd talk about Microsoft and they'd go, well, Defender, and you know what, I'll give it to them, because we used to say that too, where Defender you get for free, you need to pay for sometimes. It's better than nothing.
Yeah.
And then that's where we would put that EDR tool behind. And they, go ahead and run that as your piece. We're there to catch the stuff that's getting by, right? Now we would much rather have a more robust AV because it makes less work for the guys in the SOC.
Right.
Okay. So now fast forward to, they've really got a product that's up there. We evaluated it. That's how we ended up, kind of getting closer to Microsoft. They invited us to be part of the program. So we're in the marketplace. We're part of their certification program. And Defender for Endpoint is actually really good. Defender for Identity, very good. You're right. It's their product, right? Defender for 365, very good. The thing that's happened in the past is, I kind of harp on this. You'll hear this. The logs don't solve everything. There's a spot for them,
yeah.
But Microsoft changed what went in the logs at a point. They went and said, okay, Max clicked on a suspicious phishing email. And in the log, it used to give you the link and the URL, and you could see it, and you can take action. And then they said, we're not going to do that anymore. So it says, Max clicked on a suspicious link. Click here to go to Defender for 365 for more information. Okay. So what did that do to all of your folks who were trying to do cybersecurity through logs? It just stopped.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
And the reason is, what did I say? They're investing millions of dollars into these tools. They want people to use the tools.
Yeah.
They got a lot of pushback and they put it back in the logs for now. But if you read ahead and see where it's going, that's where it's going. And so we decided, right, that their tools are really good. It gives us another response level. With the Defender for Identity, we can actually take action on identity. Again, it goes back to, I got, 5 guys in IT, they go home on the weekend. If we see something happening on the weekend, we can actually stop it.
Yeah.
We can disable the account, or, we actually have dark web monitoring now. Say we find that someone's selling credentials on the web, we can proactively go in and disable those accounts or send them up for a password reset because it's out there.
As an old Microsoft guy, like started my career with NT 4.0, right?
Yeah.
You know, and so, I mean, you think about this, we were migrating people off of token ring onto Ethernet, and it was netware 3 to 4 migrations group-wise to, you know, I mean, there's just the value of the bundle and the price point of the bundle is so compelling that, of course, it's going to push enterprises into buying it. But like, there's just something about paying the company to protect itself for its tools that you have to, you know, it's like, oh, we have this operating system that's running, you know, that is just so complex, it's going to have stuff happen to it, right? So then you should buy your other tool to protect the operating system that, you know, you get into this like weird kind of circular conversation around it. Now, from an MDR standpoint, from an MDR provider standpoint, it takes out a huge problem in your sales cycle, which is the SIM. And, you know, you get to displace a certain amount of like, oh, how much logs are you going to ingest and how much does it cost and what does that go to and how do we scale this and how do we size it? And we don't really know how much data you're going to get to be like, oh, hey, you're running Sentinel as your SIM and we'll just take care of it for you now, right? Like that's made some things easier, I had to say.
Actually, where we meet the folks, you talked about playing Tetris and it's a journey. Mm-hmm. I talk about that too. And usually where we meet those folks are not, I've got Sentinel up and running and I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Usually it's, we're thinking about going to E5. They tell me with the E5 bundle, I get some free ingestion in Sentinel, which you do. So you get 5 meg per day per license you have, but it's only for certain pieces. All right, so if you're a bigger organization and you're looking at that and you're pulling in your firewall logs, which are Palo Alto or, you know, Fortinet, you're pulling in other pieces that are not Microsoft, you're paying for those. And they make money, right? I mean, I'm from Texas. It's like turning on the air conditioner in the summer in Texas. The meters run and they, right? So whatever comes in, they're charging, they'll send you a bill. Yeah. I mean, I think what we end up doing is talking to them a little bit about some of the alternatives, because if they have a diverse environment where they're playing Tetris and they have some of this stuff, maybe that Sentinel is not the answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we can provide another option where it gives them a year's worth of retention out of the box versus the 90 days they get with Sentinel.
That's a big problem.
At a much lower cost. If they have compliance issues, you can't do 90 days. So guess what? There's more spend there that you don't necessarily see.
Yeah.
We love it. But I think there's some people need to be aware, unless they said, hey, I've turned this on and I know what my spend is and I'm comfortable, right? It's like when you go to the cloud and you don't know what you don't know and how many machines and how much my bill is per month. You got to understand that part.
Oh, the fun of compliance where it's like, hey, we need 13 months worth of logs. We need 25 months worth of logs. You know,
I need 7 years. And well, doing what you got 10 years. Well, I don't know.
Because somebody read something and decided that it was a 7-year mandate.
You know, I had a customer there, been a long-time customer, and they came to us and said, hey, we just switched in cyber insurance, and the guy says I need 4 pen tests a year. And I said, hey, you know, he called us because he's like, I think you guys are doing a lot of this stuff already. So got him to follow them, and I went through kind of the, you know, how we do what we do and what services they have, and he's like, never mind, you're good. Because in his world, he doesn't know what, now he knows what we do for the company, and he feels pretty good about it. So, you know, 1 pen test a year, I think, is what he got down to.
I have a client, I'm going to be very careful about this one, but they have that supply chain mandatory pen test thing that runs, and, you know, their customer is using one of these like automated web services, not really sophisticated. But it's hilarious because the first time it runs, it fails. You know, it always finds something, you know, like, oh, you're running a web server. Yep, you're right. We're running a web server. You know,
guess what? You're right.
You got me. You know, you got me. But what they literally do is they let the first test run, which gives them a whole list of remediations that they have to do, and then they find in their log what the IP address for the pen test service was, and they just block that IP address. They say, okay, we've remediated everything. And then the pen test runs again, and they say, hey, look, it passed.
We can't get in.
You know, right. we resolved all the things. We remediated everything. I got to imagine that. I don't know how many people do that. I want to talk about this case study that you sent me.
Sure.
And this one actually stood out because, first off, you're an architectural design firm, right? So a high-tech user, but not necessarily, you know, I've had plenty of experiences with global design firms. It's a weird business in terms of, like, Everything's moved into computer-aided design. The biggest ones are running cycles and shifts in different, continents. So people work in one time zone and then work will go to another time zone, and you kind of have this follow the sun model. They get large enough, but it's also maybe like this traditional IT isn't making us money industry mentality across a lot of architecture and design, even engineering. We're not a target. Nobody wants us. There's nothing here of value. So it was fascinating. Anyways, that was the title of this case study that you sent, and immediately it's like, oh, this is what I talk about. And I don't want to steal too much thunder here. I want to give you some share the background.
Yeah. Well, I think it's one of those industries, like I was telling you, we started in finance and supporting that, right? And that makes sense, right? The bad guys go where the money is, right? And then the kind of market evolved and realized we need this. So these guys had an existing quote unquote provider that was doing some of the stuff for them. They got a lot of alerts. It's in the name, right? And so they were really kind of wondering, is this the right thing that we should be doing? And so they kind of started evaluating a bunch of folks. And I think if you look at the case study, they even talk about this. We kind of stood out to them, right? In terms of the ability to do different components. They were managing their own EDR in-house. They were kind of dabbling in the cloud. And the thing that they told us, we asked them, what's motivating you to do this? And they said, well, we actually see our designs show up in other countries. So the design for a building they did for somewhere in Los Angeles, up here in China.
Okay.
That's interesting. So when you talk about what is the loss, that's their IP, right? So they weren't feeling like, hey, we're not secure. We're leaking data. And I think it reached the point where they used to create these big CAD drawings, and it's an executable. And they were getting ready to do a presentation to a company, and the endpoint software wouldn't allow it to run. It was malware. Right. So you're talking a multi-million-dollar presentation, and I can't kick it off, right? Because the IT is managing the cybersecurity, right? Okay. So we kind of talked to them about how we do things, what the structure was. They're an IT team, probably of about 5 folks located in the U.S. managing this stuff. And they really recognize that they're global, right? They have offices all over. They need the 24/7, 365 monitoring. But the uniqueness to what we were bringing was the ability to respond with the tools they have. Now, we had to replace the existing vendors that were in the SIM portion of that. We replaced that very successfully, very quickly, got up and running within a couple of weeks. And what they realized as we were pulling stuff out and kind of redoing things, that they were double routing the log stuff into the current system. So their volume that they gave us was much higher than what it should have been.
Close.
That makes sense?
Yeah, I gotcha.
So we were like, oh, okay, yeah, solve that problem for you. You're not.
That's a big financial thing.
Right. You're not double routing. Actually, there's another piece to that where we talked about Microsoft, that I'll tell you, because I know these guys pretty well. So we got that down, and then we put the network service in, right? Because they have locations where they have a large amount of folks and data centers and things like that. And we were seeing a lot of the telemetry and a lot of stuff that was coming through that we were able to react to and block and help them really harden that environment, right? I think that's the part of my thing about the firewall. It's on, it's working, but no one's really looking past that, right? So we were not getting logs, we were getting the real telemetry from that full packet capture and able to actually say, hey, we need to shut this off. Are you guys using RDP over here? Why is this port open? Those type of questions started coming up immediately. Yeah. Right. And so we help, like I said, help them harden and tune that stuff. So we, close the doors. Right. Because ultimately, I'd say this every time, it's like I also provide vulnerability scanning to folks because we offer a service that's 24/7, 365 with unlimited, you can have as many incidents as you can. Now, of course, we don't like that. So we want you to harden the environment and patch these things. So we do vulnerability scanning too, right? To give them a great patching program.
You don't own the customer's environment. They hire you to help them protect it, but you don't own it, right? You can't dictate decisions on it, right? So when you get into situations where it's like, hey, this is running, it shouldn't be running, this is bad, change it. You still get a lot of pushback from people. I'm like, oh no, it's not important, we don't care about it. Or have you gotten to now a case where your customer base is sophisticated now, first had previous experiences to say, oh, thank you for finding this thing for me, let's go and take care of it, right? Because there there is still that like disconnection between, these two halves.
It's interesting for me, right? Because you've got some folks where the CFO is in charge of IT and cybersecurity, right?
Typically.
Well, no, I mean, he's like doing it.
Oh, that's okay.
Right? So we're talking like a pretty small organization,
Yeah.
right? But they're managing, $1 billion in a fund.
Oh, jeez.
Okay. So they're very grateful, right? They're like, I would have had no idea. Please help me, right? And then they'll take as much as it. And then when you got a bigger team that's more red tape, right? There's things that take a little bit longer. Eventually they figure it out. But I remember we did a company that was a big law firm up in Dallas, and we put in our network sensor, and we're munching this stuff, and we're kind of alerting on this. It's a QNAS system. And we said to them, hey, it's beaconing out to all these different countries. Is this expected? And they ignored it. And finally, we had a meeting with them, and the SOC was telling me, right, because I was involved in this deal, that this machine, we're not really sure what it is, but is trying to reach to Singapore, Taiwan, all these places for what we don't know for what. We're blocking it because we view it as a problem, but they're not really saying anything. So while we're fighting that, fire, if you really look into the news and you read, that became a problem because it's in the firmware to do that.
Yeah.
And if I have my storage device trying to send data out of the country, is that a good thing? And with just a firewall,
Well,
it's all good.
I mean, look, I rant about this plenty of times, but 99.9 infinity 9% of firewalls are deployed allow everything on the inside out. If the request originates from the inside, it's a NAT device. I mean, okay, we can get really nerdy. It's a PAT device, but it's designed to get you on the internet first and foremost, which is allow traffic from the inside outside. And not a lot of companies will go through and harden or restrict that ACL what traffic goes outbound just because it's a nightmare deal. Like this isn't like I wouldn't even call it like neglect. There's a lot of things I'll say where it's too hard. And that's one of the things I really like with, a modern SASE or SWG, that once it gets deployed is now you have something that's in line that you can start doing policy and enforcements and detection on as well. And it gives you that, I don't know, maybe that starts pushing to like my offensive question for a lot of people. Like, okay, you've got something that's now in line that can help you out a little bit more. You talk about like companies with, you say like five-person IT team, a 5-person IT team is probably supporting a 400, 500, 600 person company.
Well, these guys have, I think just over 1,000 employees.
With 5 in IT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
5 in IT.
Right. There you go. 200 to 1, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's challenging because at 200 to 1, your hair's on fire just keeping devices running. Like, forget anything on top of that. Like, it's just, that's like the super, you're never going to get to. Like, show me your folder in Outlook where you're filtering all of your log detection, events. You just don't have the resources.
Yeah. Well, I think they quickly realized when we started seeing stuff on the network and then the log and introducing the stuff and really kind of bringing that together for them, they were managing their own EDR, as I said. So they said, hey, can you manage what we have? And it turns out we could, right? So we were able to absorb that as part of the service. So when you now look at where we got to, we were getting telemetry from the network, from the logs, as well as from the endpoint, all into our back end, which is the kind of best way to do this, right? If you look at it, if I just have a part of the story and no way to respond, and this is where I get back to, if I just get logs and I don't have control of that endpoint, the endpoint may become compromised and not give any signals, but the logs will tell us when they try to move around.
Mm-hmm.
So we actually have seen cases where the log triggers an event and we're able to jump in, correlate, go out to that endpoint and isolate that endpoint and stop the threat there. Now, of course, the question is, why is the endpoint? If you look at who we work with the best of the best.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't that picking it up? And that goes into now, you look at what we do in the SOC, we are actually backed by our threat response unit, which is made up of guys that do threat intel. We generate our own threat intel. Last year, it's 35%, 12% seen by nobody else, right? So it's pretty good because of the amount of stuff we see.
Mm-hmm.
And keep in mind, we subscribe to like some pretty expensive threat feeds, right? And then it's also got reverse malware engineering guys. So with the new stuff that comes in like that, we're going to break it down and figure out how did they get by this. I remember seeing one that came out and the process tree was like a mile long. EDR is going to break at some point. And if it goes that deep and then runs some little command, they got, I don't know, even if I'm doing it, looking at it myself, if you're not a seasoned veteran.
You said something, though, that I want to highlight for a second, which was, I mean, the first part of it is if you're running into this and you're trying to do this internally, where you're trying to outsource this to your, your neighborhood MSP, right? It's not just a people resource issue, right? It's also like what's behind the people and what else, like how much are you seeing? You sit in a position where you see lots of stuff. You're getting lots of data. You're seeing lots of networks. You see a much bigger position of the internet of what's happening at any given time. And a lot of that you have internal proprietary. And then you also subscribe, keyword, you buy data from other organizations to give you augmented information on top of that. And, like a little MSP, it says I've got 3 people on my security team, and they're not spending the money to do this kind of correlation because, again, they don't have the resource to even think about doing it, or they can't aggregate it because they're not equipped to aggregate either. So I think that's also, I don't know how to educate or talk about these things in terms of what those scales actually, and sizes. You gave a number earlier, and this was an example of hey, our cost for the year was $75,000 for this organization. That number stood out to me for a couple of reasons. And the first one is when you talk about average salary for an IT practitioner, and then you can do it weighted based on, taxes and everything else, right? Location, right? But, it's pretty common to say you have a $60,000 to $80,000 range for an IT professional inside the company, right? And it's not a super senior person. This is just, in your IT team. So from an efficiency, I think that the dirty thing that happens is people assume outsourcing or bringing in service providers, you're coming out for the jobs. And it's well, no, you're not coming out from you're trying to augment and let you live a better life in the, but it's $75,000. That's roughly one IT person worth of expense. Let's just, approximate. And if you say, okay, that's 200 devices at the high end of the scale for a lot of people in terms of protection, 200 users to one IT, your coverage ratio, and I'm inferring a lot here in my head, right? So correct me, but the coverage ratio in terms of devices to cost to what it would actually take you to run this internally is probably way more efficient than people even understand.
Well, I give you that number, right? As a baseline, because that's the actual number in the game. And that included the hardware, software, 24/7, 365 support.
Mm-hmm.
So if I get one guy, and a security guy is more expensive, and just call it what it is.
Yep.
It's more money. And how do you retain them?
No, they don't stay. That's the thing people don't understand. It's not even about hiring them. It's about retaining, because your job sucks.
I'm looking at your logs.
Yeah.
And that gets kind of boring.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's way more efficient in terms of that. And you're right, we're not coming after their jobs unless they said, hey, I built a SOC and they kind of are no good. then we are. But the reality is that we need guys on their side in IT or with some security, hat that they can put on that says, hey, we saw this, we've responded in this way, we've isolated this host. There's also problems over here, or business email compromise, right? That's the big threat. That's kind of real scary, actually. I got into your email, and then now I'm emailing other people as you, and that they know you, they like you, and they trust you.
Yep.
And I'm posing as you, and then I have these rules set up to delete those sent messages so that you can't kind of figure out what's going on. We can detect that stuff and help with that. It's very tricky, right? Because it's about finding those rules and those auto forwarders and those things that are in place, and then looking at logins and where things are coming from. The customer at that point has to have the savvy to say, this is happening, let us know so we can look at it. So yeah, I mean, it gets down to, I can't even hire a guy for what it costs for the service. Granted, you can buy the whole menu and make an argument.
Yeah.
And I'm going to bring the hardware and the software in most cases.
Yeah.
If you say, hey, I already got my own software, Microsoft. Okay, great. Then the argument becomes there, but you're still, need the management and the people with expertise to understand that, right? Because if you give it to an IT guy and it says, well, this trigger went off, I don't know what that means. And you better have the ability to find someone who can help you. Right.
I do this a lot in terms of what's the maturity of the buyer? What's the maturity of the organization? I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years. I mean, I was this personality. It's you have a, maturity curve where when you're at the beginning stages of that, you want to do everything yourself.
Yeah.
And there's a certain of like, oh, I want to figure this out. I want to learn how to do this. This sounds like fun. I want to buy this box. Like, and it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say like malicious is the right word, but it's not necessarily like bad. Like, then like there's no bad intent behind it. It's just like, I want to do this thing, right? And then as the maturity and as time and industry extends, the shift becomes my value to the organization isn't buying the box and typing on the keyboard anymore. It's executing the program to keep the business functioning and growing, right? Like that becomes a big maturity shift, okay, for a lot of people in the IT space around if I can bring resources on that are more efficient than what we can do ourselves, that's a win, right? It's a win for me because I can take vacations without my cell phone and my computer. And it's a win for the organization because the organization gets what it needs, right? And then, of course, it's more efficient resources and things like that play out. So that goes back to the earlier question, right? Which is, how do you sell this to somebody who's not buying it? Or how do you sell this to somebody who's not already had a bad experience, either with another MSSP or MSP or trying to do it themselves? Or, whoops, we did have the incident that people told us we were going to have, but we didn't think we were going to have because, we're an HVAC contractor for Target and we're not a Target. It's a fun pun, non-intentional, but
it's a circular, what do you call it? It's infinite loop.
Right. What pushes that conversation?
So, well, I think what's happening, you mentioned it earlier, right, is that cyber insurance is getting more and more stringent on what you have to do to have it. Mm-hmm. So some of these companies who, just like you said, hey, I'm going to buy an insurance policy and do what I want, can't do it anymore. They can't pencil whip that stuff in. Now, if you look at what we see with cyber insurance, they're saying you have to monitor your logs 24/7, 365. You have to monitor your EDR endpoint. You have to have EDR. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you have to have network protection in place. All the things we've been doing for years, they're now saying you can't get a policy with us unless you're doing those things. We sat down and talked to a guy, and he was like, well, my cyber policy is going to go up either 75% or 300%. But I need to do the things you do. How do I get on your software?
I need to do the things you do as a baseline just to only get the 300.
To hit the 75%. Yeah. So, the guy was with it. So you're saying 75% is a good thing? He's like, it's an unbelievable thing.
Yeah.
And so they're getting tired of paying. Okay, let's just figure it out here. So they're pushing it down. Compliance and privacy are pushing down more and more. You have to be able to show and prove these things. So in the smaller organizations, an HVAC company, unless they're, getting really bigger, an organization and bought up by someone, we see this a lot, right? Mergers and acquisitions.
A lot of PE activity, kind of industry right now.
Yeah. So I bought, Joe's AC, and now I'm bringing him in under my umbrella. And now he's part of my risk. Mm-hmm. And then we actually will evaluate it for them and say, holy cow, you need to really, and some of them have it really ironed out, right? Where they're going, you're going to do this and here's how it's going to go, and everything's coming into our back end, and they've got like a, network in a box. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we got a couple of different ways of solving it, but that's really what is happening is the insurance, the guys who say, I can just buy insurance and I'm covered. I mean, you remember the guys that had on the whiteboard, don't turn on your computer today. You remember that whole thing, right? I mean, it's a while ago. These are, today, that's a reputational thing you can't pull back, right? And so that's part of it too. I mean, I think if you look, right, Max, at what we did, we bought a company that was an IR company. They had some cool software that allowed us to do some things in an incident response that, faster, better, whatever, all that stuff. But the real reason I think that we were interested in acquiring that is because it's a great source of leads for us. The guys who don't believe and they get beat, and then they end up in this IR world where they're paying literally $400 or $500 per hour for someone to come in and try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, to figure out how bad it is.
And then they go, well, tell us about this MDR thing that you talked to us about earlier. Yeah, we weren't designed to kind of after the fact come in and do something.
Yeah.
So if the MDR was rolled out, the odds are we saw it, we put out that fire.
Yeah.
We saw it here, we correlated it here, we put out the fire before it became an event, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you that we don't see things like you can go to my website and look under, I tell everybody this because I think it's actually really interesting story. The threat response unit has a page called resources that has videos of bad things that happen to good people, right? And there's one on there that we actually wrote a detection because we saw how the bad guys were getting around stuff using living off the land binaries, right? And using stuff that looks like normal processes. And we're doing our thing, and that trigger went off. And so it created the investigation in the SOC. The guy started looking at it and then said, wait a minute, this is actually the worst thing that could be happening. And so as it got escalated to the incident handlers, right, they peeled back the view and said, this is on 200 plus computers. It's 3 a.m. Okay, no alert's going to do anything. Mm-hmm. So the guys in the SOC made the decision to isolate all of the machines. They dug into the registry because they had actually put a logic bomb in there to encrypt. And it was a scene from Mission Impossible. I got to unwind this stuff before the timer hits 0. And they were able to do that successfully for the majority of the machines. And when the customer came in the morning, they had no idea. I mean, if you can't understand what could have happened, that company would have gone away at night. And it's not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's fact.
I had a client, hospital, county funded, and, I was out of the engineering operational side of it. At that point, I was talking with them, and they had really old firewalls that had never been patched. And I mean, like your typical low, like just not a lot of budget, right? You make the best, you do what you can with the budget you have, kind of so. And part of that was just not having that technical expertise and resources necessary, to take care of certain things. And I got into a conversation that was basically like, I will come in and do this for you for free. Like, let us help you solve some of these basic problems. Like, you need to update your firmware. I mean, and then there was like a known exploit on this particular firewall manufacturer. That firmware was like, I personally will come tonight to your hospital and sit in the computer room with you and show you how to, and I think the network engineer was on vacation, was the other part of it. I was telling the CIO, like, I will do this with you. Like, you can stand there with me and watch me do it. You do not have to pay me. Just let me do it, was kind of the thing. And they ended up with Petra, and they ended up, because they were a trauma center, and their entire system went offline, having to take and put people onto ambulances and transfer them to other facilities. And fast forward, so I mean, I'm giving this story like linear. I mean, there's gaps in time here, from the like, please let me help you, to like something bad happening wasn't like the next day. I mean, there was a significant gap of time. But then after something bad happened and they were going through recovery on it, it was, we can help you recover this. Basically, it was like let's just show up and just like set fire to everything, basically, just rebuild your environment from scratch. Like, right now, like, let's just get started. And the CIO was, we need to hire a team to come in and go through and figure out what happened and how we prevent it from happening. No, you don't. You don't. What happened is you had nothing running and you weren't doing anything about it and you were patching. I can tell you what happened already. You don't go spend $1 million to be told that you had nothing in place to then try to figure out how to start recovering from it, because all you're doing is you're just delaying your recovery 5, 6, 7 weeks. It was a really interesting, frustrating experience for me to sit through, of like that mentality on the other side of the table. And I'll never forget it. I mean, it's I mean, of course, I'm just like, burn all the ships, let's just go in, and get you up and ready. This isn't difficult. They weren't that big. It wouldn't have been that big of a thing. Like, we're talking about like 1,000 devices, would have sucked, but it wouldn't have been that bad.
Well, if they had, backups with the ability to restore.
If they had anything,
that would have though.
their backups were corrupted.
That's the thing that they don't get, right? If they're not watching that, then they know, like, if I can get to your backups and I can kill those, or they've never tested them. The odds are you're go up that you're going to pay. I mean, they have better tech support than, we're giving them, right? Let's just call it what it is, because they want you to pay. They want you to have a good experience and come back again, right?
Repeat customer.
Yeah, customer service is at its optimal there. But I think that, sometimes we've had that where folks, we're telling them, the service, and the guy is like, the decision maker, the guy, okay, says, this is good, but I need you to do a pen test first. And I say, well, you can take that money and invest that into the solution. And we're like looking at this stuff in real time all day, every day. Much better than a pen test. And he's like, I understand what you're saying, but I can't get it approved until you show me there's
a problem.
blood in the water.
Oh, genius.
And so we do the pen test, come back with the results. He's super happy, right? Like, okay, you found the vulnerabilities that's going to get me the money to do.
Yep.
That is a reality of where they're saying, you know, we don't have an unlimited budget and no projects and nothing's going on in the world. They do have budgets, and some of them don't have a budget. So to show them, here's the problem, and that's an extreme case where the problem is you have a problem.
Yeah.
But we run into that too.
I mean, how often is that, right? Because from an evaluation and onboarding, you know, you can go through and put a network sensor on, like forget like deploying an EDR or repositioning an EDR to point to you, right? Like just putting a network sensor in and running it for a while and seeing what comes back. I mean, how often is that in a sales cycle, like the linchpin in the sales cycle, saying, okay, we put a sensor out, and by the way, did you know that your NAS is sending all your data to some other country?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you a real life story.
Mm-hmm.
We had a big grocery wholesaler that signed up for the network service. They already had something for logging, and they already had an endpoint. We put it in. The first thing that happens is we stand it up and we go into a tuning mode. Now, the tuning mode means that everything is guilty until proven innocent, right? So first weekend, we turn it on. We call them up and say, hey, you have 18 machines infected with TrickBot malware. And their response was interesting, kind of like a dog, you know, like tilted his head, like, that's impossible. And we said, here's the forensics, right? Like,
Here's like 18 machines.
they're checking in, right? And we said, why is that impossible? I said, we have Cylance, and Cylance solves everything. And so we said, okay, here's the forensics, here's the, you know, we'll figure that out. And then we reconvene on Monday, and they said, okay, Cylance said that we have it configured wrong. And then we said, oh, by the way, do you know you have 4 active tunnels to Southern America? And they were like, no, shut those off immediately. So that led to a much bigger conversation about why is the endpoint not picking this, and why is it misconfigured? And we thought it, you know, according to marketing, solves 99.9% of our problems. So yeah, it ended up being that they switched over, brought us in to do the endpoint immediately, and then, you know, the log was already on the schedule. You know, sometimes, like you said, hey, we have this technology, this tech debt, we have to manage it for a certain point. The beauty of it is, at that point, we were already doing the network service, proving our value in the first 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then that moved it to an EDR piece where we're bringing that in, more telemetry, and then the logs when they switched off.
I mean, there's a phrase, right? There's defense in depth, right? Like this blind, like I mean, I hate tech marketing. Like it's one of my, going back to like 98, 99, where it was trying to be like, hey, we need a cluster for our database. And what is a cluster? You know, and like, oh, everything's a cluster. You know, like,
There's another word for that.
yeah, everything. Check the box, right? Do we do clustering? Yes, we do. Check. Yeah. You're like, okay, now evaluate this technology. But, you know, like you can't really assume that any one thing is going to be infallible or be perfect, right? And that's why it's like you need to have a security log gateway, and you need to have, you know, a network sensor, and you need to have an EDR, and you need to have a this, and you need to have a that, and then of course it becomes, well, budget, and then priorities, and how do you layer this stuff up and in what order, right? And I mean, email vulnerabilities are key, and this hustle's like, it's hard because SMB and the smaller side of the SMB market, you know, like the sub 200 user, it's hard to get them tools that they need because they don't have the budget, they don't have the experience, they don't have the, you know, resources for it. And you're like, okay, well, I know you're on the small business version of 365 or on Google Workspace because you're 200 people, but you really need to be on the enterprise version of it because you need to get access to this feature in order to bring this other tool on top of it in order to protect you what you actually need. Like, you know, a conversation a couple of weeks ago, real estate GP, small team, sponsoring multi-million-dollar deals, and they wired money out to an LP that they thought was the right place, and it wasn't. And like they knew what, like it was not a, like, you know, I mean, after the fact, he's like, they knew not to do that kind of stuff, and it still happened because it just finally that one moment took place, and the right, like, timing just conspired against them just perfectly, and they got the money back, thankfully. But you know, that's pretty rare. But they're a small team, you know. You're like, okay, 15 people, you know, 20 people, like they don't have the capacity for tools for that.
Well, I think it's a false sense you mentioned earlier about I put it all in the cloud, right? I switch to that and I'm all good, right? Well, you know, you read the agreement, they're protecting their stuff, not your stuff. It says at point blank, it's a shared responsibility model. And so if you do things badly, it's on you, right? So yeah, I mean, email gateways and work to a certain extent. And I I always tell people, like I joked about the firewall earlier, I'm never going to walk in and say, throw out your firewall. Oh, I do. Let us do it. Hey, that's doing something, right? Keep it there. Let us help you.
For the record, I do tell people to throw the firewall.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, so I know.
But I want them to replace it with something else.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, I can get behind that. You know, for us, yeah, we would love to have that too, because if they're running something that, you know, I don't have it configured properly, it's more work, right, for us. Like we're already looking for a needle in a stack of needles. We might as well cut out as many needles as we can, right? So, but yeah, when you switch to the cloud and they go, we're all secure, we're all safe, or I got an email gateway. If we have an email gateway that solves everything, why are we still dealing with business email compromise? Yep. Right. So it gets down to, I remember hearing a guy give a talk, and this was the most interesting story, because he was talking about an attorney who had gotten his email and bad things were happening. And you know that the law firm, they know a lot of things about a lot of
Yeah.
So he was talking about how, you know, I don't understand how they got in. You know, it's all in the cloud, it's all hosted. And then as they dug into the forensics, he was like told, like, it was because your Yahoo email was compromised. When was the last time you changed your email address on your Yahoo personal email? And he goes, I have never changed that since college or whatever, but never. And he goes, tell me it's not me. And the guy, it's you, you know, like, so even though you're in the cloud and your users aren't doing good hygiene and they're sharing passwords. I mean, we've seen that. We walked into a customer in Southern California that's just down the road here. And the guy we're meeting with, right, just, you know, we're talking to him about new stuff because we always bring out new stuff. And the guy in the back goes, East End Tires here, you know, when I come in and say, he goes, oh, I love those guys. And he goes, what happened? He goes, just this morning, they gave me a notification that my employee in the UK had been phished. And I called the guy in the UK and I said, hey, did you just change your password on, you know, your Apple ID? And he goes, how did you know that? And he goes, did you click on a link to do it? And he goes, yeah, I did, because they said I had a problem. And then he said, well, hopefully you're not using the same password for my corporate ID as your Apple ID, because I'm kicking you off the network right now. And we were able to detect that and give him the notification in a timely fashion. That, I mean, we have all had that.
So this is where I was saying earlier, which is really smart people make bad decisions. And when you have really smart people that are just on the unfortunate receiving end of a professional who has experience at scale, right? Like you don't stand a chance. Like you know, and especially if, like, you know, the wrong timing of circumstances conspire against you, because that person is like late to go to his, you know, child's dance recital and is like struggling to get out the door, and then something else is going on, and the dog's in the hospital, and like the car's in the shop, and then something else is going on, and then they get this thing and they're like, oh, okay, I just can't deal with this right now, I'm just gonna click it, right? And you just have that moment, and it's like, so they're, you know, the cause of it, but you know, your threat envelope increases. You know, each person you hire, each device you put on your network, you just, you know, you have this, you know, like, it just gets worse and worse for you, you know, and you can't protect. Now, I mean, my argument against that specific example is, you know, a hardware-based two-factor authentication, you know, which is, so many companies don't want to roll these things out because they're perceptually a pain in the butt, right, to manage, but it's really hard to take advantage of somebody's hardware-based two-factor authentication mechanism into your network, because you can't use Cyrillic lettering and fake a URL bar that people think is the same, because the hardware keeps going, nope, that's not the same website. I'm going to give you my credentials.
Yeah. Well, I think what happens is, in companies that traditionally don't do security, the guys who won't adopt it are the ones at the most risk. Right? And you think a law firm, right? Everybody's doing some sort of two-factor authentication except the guys, the main people that are at risk. They're like, it's too hard, I'm not going to do it. Take it off.
Well, the quote I got was, it sounds like a drag.
Well, you know, it's never really, you know, that's the challenge, right? Is that how much is enough? How much is too much, and when does it become an inconvenience? And a lot of it has to be someone has to get marked to really get to that point.
Well, I mean, I don't know what the exact math is, right? But if you're talking about an architecture firm who's finding their buildings being built in other countries,
Yeah.
you know, I mean, the value for a building is half a billion dollars, let's say, construction costs, right? So it's like your $50 million architecture fee, like,
Yeah, these are high rises.
yeah, right.
Not small things.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal. You know, the lawyer, if you're involved in any sort of M&A activity, right? You have non-public information that's going on about a company that can then be used to manipulate a stock price, right? So that's actually spawns a question, which is board has a fiduciary duty, right, to the stockholders of a company to make decisions in the best interest of the company, right? And a billion years ago, when we were dealing with, you know, BCDR, so Southern California, it's always the 10-0 earthquake is the thing. Oh, we have to be prepared for the 10-0 earthquake. And it became this exercise around, what do we have to do to be ready for the 10-0 earthquake? Okay, we have to have a second data center, we have to have this, we have to do that, we have to do this whole thing. And I've written more business continuity disaster recovery plans in my lifetime than I ever want to. I mean, like, if I never write another one, not a big one,
You'll be okay.
very happy. It was really frustrating as an IT guy because I didn't really understand that the exercise wasn't implementing the plan. The exercise was writing the plan and then letting the board say, oh, it's too expensive, we're not going to do it. But we stamped our fiduciary duty to say we evaluated the plan, right? How do you think that's going to shift now? Because there becomes this thing of like, oh, you know, again, risk tolerance. Well, the risk of the 10-0 happening is so low that it probably isn't going to be a thing, and we shouldn't spend this money because we won't see a return on it. But cybersecurity isn't like, I don't want to say like it's a good guarantee you're going to have an event, but it really feels like we're getting to the point where it's a guarantee that you're going to have an event, and the question is just how severe is it? So when do we cross over and start talking about, now are we at personal liability within the board and the C-suite if certain things don't happen?
Well, that comes from regulations, right? And the teeth that they can do. Like if you look at the SEC, right, they had guidelines and then kind of things, and now they've switched over to now where you have regulations and things you have to do, and then you have to report.
Well, they have the reporting requirement that's kicked in, yes.
Yeah, and then now there's fines associated with things. Because we would run into companies, right? That was our bread and butter when we started. And they said, well, I'll just pay the fine. That's my answer. Because it's cheaper than your service. You know what I mean? And so...
No, it's not.
Yeah, well, anyway, that's what their thought was. They're not switching, right? Yeah. Because there's more of that. I don't know the answer to that, right? Like, that is an interesting topic, but... if you look at the guys like SolarWinds, when that whole thing went down, you know, the C-suite pretty much was all cleaned out.
Yeah.
At some point, right? So you had it was a resume generating event, right?
I know a guy, he leads a security team for a large company. And, you know, he had an experience with his boss where it was, okay, give me the laundry list of what you need, you know, put the plan together. And not to say they have no security, but like he came back with a very comprehensive plan around what was necessary. And of course it was rejected. It was like, we're not going to give you the money to do this. You know, figure, you know, like if you want this much, we're going to give you this much, and like figure it out. It was a conversation that was happening with him, you know, really came into this like sense of like, he was collecting a good paycheck, but he was well paid to be fired, is how he kind of expressed it to me, you know?
Well, there's the acronyms. Have you heard those for the CISO, right? It's a Chief Scapegoat Officer or whatever. I forget the exact thing right now. But in the past, they didn't really have a program to become a CISO. You were just promoted into that to care about it because you were the one they were going to, you know, put out there for everybody that you've missed the mark if something, you know, happened. So now it's changed a little bit, right? Because if you really look, though, those guys the average tenure is about 1.5 years, and they'll move.
Yep.
And then the guys who've been through an event where they've lost ransomware and all that, they don't want to do it again.
No, of course not.
Right? And so they'll come in. I mean, we see a lot, right, where guys will move companies and bring us along.
Yeah.
Right? And that's how we've moved upstream a lot, right?
Well, frankly. This was the beginning, right? Like this whole like scar tissue. So you have to have enough experiences with this, like we have locks on our doors. Why? You know, how many people have been, you know, their house has been robbed, or is this just like institutional memory that's passed down over like multiple generations of like, yes, lock your front door, you know, a little bit more complicated than that. in cyber, like you can't just lock your front door, so to speak, anymore, but
The windows are open.
I will have free credit monitoring for the rest of my life. Like, I got a letter I opened up last night, and this, of course, is our third-party cloud processor, had a breach or whatever, and I won't name who it is, but at this point, everybody's probably knows, and blah 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 blah. You read through the paragraphs, and it's like, and they didn't actually disclose what was lost, but I mean, I know everything you have on gone. It was like, oh, but here, click this link with this code to get your free credit monitor. It's just like, great, wonderful. I mean, literally, but that has like a scaled risk mechanism. And I wonder, is insurance like the default for insurance? Like, is it insurance companies going to buy Experian at some point because it's cheaper for them to offer the free credit monitoring package if they actually own the credit bureau?
And you didn't ask for them to do anything with your data.
I didn't want them to have my data in the first place. But then you get into this whole thing where you're like, what's it actually cost them at scale to negotiate credit monitoring? They're spending $5 on me for the year for credit monitoring.
Well, it's way less than doing nothing and then having, say, some lawsuit form and all of that fun stuff. So yeah, it's a de facto thing. I'd have quite a bit of credit monitoring as well. I think my phone company just set me one for another year.
Yeah. Right. And free credit monitoring for life.
And so the good news is I already kind of have it through, I think, one of my credit cards that I have. And they just, anytime they send me an email, I'm afraid it's a fish. So I go to the other source and and I log into that app and I look and see what the difference is. And I'm actually, it's interesting, right? Because you can make $1 million a month and your credit score could be, 500. Right? But if you're in debt, your credit score is pretty good, right? So it's a little bit of a interesting paradigm there. But yeah,
I've always kind of wondered who drives this. Like, we see some of it being the insurance companies driving it. They're like, insurance companies don't want to pay out, right? Of course, in the business, in order for them to make money, they have to not pay claims. So this becomes more and more restrictive. And right now, it's like, okay, you have to run a secure email gateway, you have to run an EDR, you have to do security awareness training. It's like check, right? And people go out and check those boxes. And it feels like the next step of that's going to be like, okay, you were running an EDR, but you didn't configure the EDR, or you didn't look, that's going to get more and more stringent, right? Is my perception on these things. What I'm curious about becomes when does the D&O insurance get pierced? Pick any major exploit that's happened or compromise. People lose their jobs. That's usually the result, right? Maybe there's some plug in the organization that maybe stops it for a while, but eventually Sony Pictures, president lost her job over that hack, right? It's some point somebody goes, but when does it actually shift from, or do you think, does it shift from, okay, you lose your job and that becomes personal liability, to like, oh, you didn't invest in basic things, like now you're personally liable. Not like your insurance is going to defend you, but like you've now breached, like a basic responsibility of like, you are personally liable because you said, no, let's not go out and buy the EDR.
Well, I think people would reconsider those jobs if that became a personal thing. But to some extent, your reputation is there. I know I would look differently if I was hiring someone from one of these companies that really got owned bad and it came out that they weren't doing the right things or not patching their Apache servers. I would suggest that that's a problem. That the interesting thing is, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't really thought about that, Max, right? Like, when does it cross over into you're saying I'm signing up for that? And if you try and do the right things, and I'll tell you what, we've seen it. And like, where we had a company that we talked to for quite a bit. I don't know how much time I got. This is very
good. We play time. Let's go.
All right. So
Jesse he'll start flashing a light at me, but we're going to keep going.
All right. So here's the situation. Trading company.
Okay.
Right.
We say trading like brokerage stocks, or trading like
like they're trading company, right? And they're doing that as their business. So they have a cybersecurity folks, right? They have networking folks, and they said, hey, we need to get the posture. We want to bring you guys in, and we want to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then the network sensor was the first thing to be put in. Well,
easy and quick,
yeah. So cybersecurity guy said, we're doing this. The networking guys in Chicago said to himself, I used to work at a MSP, and how terrible it was because they didn't have the support. So his personal feelings of how we would do this affected his judgment. So he put us in on a switch three layers deep, monitoring like 4 or 5 users, so that when they evaluated, at the 1 month mark, what we were seeing nothing. It was like, we're sitting there kind of in the conversation before the meeting saying, why are we not seeing any traffic? Why are we not blocking anything? We should be seeing something, a lot of things. We didn't know he put us there at the time. So then we had to go back to the security guy and say, we're really not seeing anything here. This is like odd. We're not sure.
Yeah.
And so the security guy was like, okay, let me find out what's going on. And he came back a week later after he figured out what had happened. And he basically said, hey, I'm leaving this organization because they are not going to do the right things. They're not going to protect themselves. So he actually put in his resignation with no job and went and found another job. That company got breached a while ago because we basically decided we weren't a mutual fit right at that point.
Right.
Because if we weren't adding value and they were not willing to do the things, right, let's just call it what it is.
Yeah.
But he was right, and he made his personal brand decision based on what he saw the reaction when he figured out why we weren't seeing anything. He went to his higher ups and said, this guy did it this way, there's no chance. And they just said, we don't care, kind of was the attitude. And I don't know if they just didn't want to spend the money, right? Still don't know the answer, but we did see him make that personal decision to get out before the breach. Because if you've lived through the breach, it's no fun.
It's kind of like, it's not like when you're going to have data loss, it's just how bad is it going to be, right? It's not when you find out that your tape backup isn't working, right?
Well, it's like sometimes it's when.
It's like how bad was it, and what's wild to me about these things, I'm thinking through stories. It's like self-soothing here, body language, right? I'm going to start rocking to myself.
Warm up.
The stats are so scary, which I think has gotten to a point where people like just don't believe the stats anymore. Like X percentage of companies are going to get breached, and X percentage of those companies are going to go under within X percent of, with X months of time. And you're like, okay, maybe if the stat was like, oh, it's 15%, people would believe it more. But you're like, oh, no, the majority of companies are going to get breached, and the majority of those companies are going to go under, and that's just the end of it. And then, of course, you get some of these that become these really just like unbelievable visuals, Colonial Pipeline, where people are like, have tarps in the back of their pickup trucks putting gasoline in the tarps. And you're like, what is going on here, And then I'll never forget the quote. I was really impressed, actually, that it was, then me, the news, with the Wall Street Journal, I had an interview with the CEO, and it was, we paid the ransom, and the decision to pay the ransom was because we didn't know how bad it was.
Right.
It wasn't like we paid the ransom to get recovered. It was like, we just don't even know how, like what recovery looks like. And so we're going to, $11 million based on what we knew at that point, or whatever, I think it was $11 million, was cheap because we just didn't even know how bad it was. And then, of course, they start trickling down, like, what was the cause and what was the original exploit, and like all these different things. You're like, man, like really basic stuff anywhere along the chain here would have prevented this from happening. And I think that's the worst thing is looking at that after the fact and knowing like really basic things, not expensive, really basic things along the way, and solve these problems for people.
Yeah, and the checkbook comes out right at that point, right? We're either going away or we're not. And I think the stat, you mentioned that's really weird is when they issue like the Verizon report and stuff, and they go, how many millions of dollars a ransomware event would cost you, right? And the smaller organizations, that really are, they don't believe it. They're the target because they're the gateway into other bigger organizations, right? They don't believe that. Mm-hmm. They look at that and go, what do you mean? It's an average event is $2 million. And I don't know the number of the latest report, honestly, but I know it's something like that, right?
Yeah.
And they're just like, there's no way. Like, I don't even have $2 million in the bank, right? Mm-hmm. And so they don't think we're going away at that point.
Yeah. Well, it's your incident response team that you have to hire is really expensive. Your loss of revenue is really expensive. Your loss of customer goodwill is really expensive. It's
credit monitoring is
expensive. Yeah. That's why I've kind of come to this idea of like, is it just scar tissue, right? It's like if you see your neighbor lose their job because their company didn't have something in place, doesn't that like, you're like hit home a little bit and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should be doing this because that's important to me and I don't want to lose my job. Or the pressures on, supply chain being a real thing. I see a lot of this now where, and actually, I don't, some of the compliance specs and things you have to adhere to are a little, interesting. I have a friend I help this with, and he's in the motion picture, business. And so he has to adhere to TPN, and he's a single practitioner. He's a sole, like, it's just him, like, doing what he does. Right. But, in order to get him what he needed in order to meet the requirements for TPN, like, some of these things you have to license at quantities that, like,
yeah, right. We run into that. Like, it's a minimum of X.
yeah. So so the best thing we found was, we could license this suite for him at 25 users, and it's like, well, he's like, I've got, it's like, it's just him. And it's like, well, your parents are going to have the best cybersecurity program that they could buy. Just like, literally, it's like your parents, your wife's parents, the guy, your neighbors you really like, just like, look them all up. Yeah, that was just it, but he had to have it in order to conduct business. So, like, it was also this interesting thing. You see the actual impact of non-compliance. I think people try to, like, fudge compliance a lot, but in this case of, like, you have to have this in order for us to pay you. And it was like, okay, great, I'm gonna go get it right now. How quickly can I have this? Because I want to get paid. And I've seen that a lot in manufacturing. It's like, oh, you're a subcontractor making an assembly for this big company. And guess what? It chains all the way down that line of you have to now do X, Y, and Z in order to get.
Yeah. Well, I think, when you really look at what MDR offers, it becomes table stakes for a lot of those small companies. They have to be doing it to do business because we walked into a law firm, had a great meeting, talked about stuff, and they said, well, what's motivating you to do this now, kind of question, right? Like, they were buying, right? Yeah. So it's not answering your question. They were buying, but the reason they were buying was because he points out the window and goes, see that big building right there with the big shell on top? If I don't get this, they're not going to give me my contract. So that motivated them to take it seriously, is that it pushed down from their, big vendor that they were doing business with.
Look, obviously there's outliers within this and people that actually get it, small trade, hedge funds, right? They understand it, small investment banks, they understand it, right? And then you get into this weird thing where it's like, maybe they're only 20 people or they're 30 people or 50 people, right? And they have a very different program. But the average 50-person company is investing in this stuff. What's your feel in terms of sizing? Like, at what point are people, large enough that they start looking at this thing a little differently? It's 200 seats, 500 seats, 1,000 seats. Like, what becomes like that entry point where people have matured to the point where they're looking at this seriously?
I think it boils down to a couple things, right? Is like, what industry are they in, right? If they're washing windows or doing, plumbing, they don't care so much, right? Because they've got a platform that does the scheduling and does the billing online, and everything should be taken care of, right? And they get in, someone gets in their email. The risk there is that they send the payment to the wrong place, right? Like, my wife works for a company and she does the accounting, and she came home and said, oh, I got to send this wire to this guy. And he gave me this email. And I said, well, boy, like, hold on a minute. Like, have you spoken to him on the phone? She'd never considered the fact that this can be a scam.
Yeah.
So what does it take, right, at that point? Now, she's uber aware now, right? Like, uber aware, because, like, the space I'm in and the stories I told her, really, that's kind of what it takes, I think, is that one person who can stand up and say, this is what we need to be doing. These are the risks. Because if we send the money to the wrong place and it's gone, that's how much of our revenue, that's our payroll for the week, whatever, right? Now you're impacting families. So I've seen it where guys, funny stories, you get during this stuff. I touch a lot of customers, as you can imagine. I got a pretty good memory. And, I remember talking to this company, and they were like, yeah, this all sounds great. Let me see what we do. And they just kind of went away, faded away. And then they called up out of the blue and said, okay, we're ready to go. And we talked to them and said, what changed? It says, well, our CEO went on a trip to Hawaii and went to a meeting. They talked about this. And they said, you have to do it. So he came back and it was his idea, so we're doing it. And what does it take? It takes the right people to stand up and go, it's worth it. to have the protection. And I go back to simplistic story. Okay. So I'll kind of help you answer the question in a non-technical way.
Please.
Okay. So one of the sales guys I work with had a plane ride with a, guy's a CIO, CISO level of a company. And he, what do you do? Oh, I sell cybersecurity. Yeah. What do you do? And then, oh, well, and he goes, well, so explain to me what you do. And his thought process was not to go into the pitch, right? It's easy to do, right? But he said, so if I could bring to you a guy who handled your cybersecurity and looked at the network and the endpoints and the logging events, and this guy had a bunch of friends that all came with him, so he could do it around the clock. He had all the software and hardware as part of his deal. And he never went on vacation. He never got sick. He never wanted to get a certification and leave. Would you hire that guy? And the guy goes, yeah, I'd hire him right now. And he goes, that's what we do.
I love that as an ending point to this. I can keep going. I'm sure we can spend another hour here. I think that's an excellent point to end on, where I hope that when we talk in the future, things have matured to the point where people understand they're going after and are investing in this in a much more serious way, right? And it just becomes what level of investment is reasonable for the type of business we're running, right? Not do we need an EDR or not, or do we need this or not, or do we even need this in the first place or not? It's at what extreme event do we go to, right? We get into conversations around, is microsegmentation appropriate for you or not? I hope to see that soon, I don't know what else to say. I hope to see that soon, but
yeah, well, I think everything evolves, and there's usually events that happen and that create action. I think that's the matter of that, right? Is when you don't know you need it, that event will take place, and like you said, hopefully it's not you, it's your neighbor, and then you're able to say, hey, I did the right things, because I see the guys who are customers and they go, send me an email. Hey, you know what? You guys just saved the bacon again. And that's fulfilling for him because he's done the right thing.
yeah,
It's fulfilling for me because I know our organization is doing the right things. And the IT guys, right? They're happy because they're not dealing with this big, huge deal. It's like, hey, I got to go re-image Max's machine. Right?
a lot of people I don't think actually really take it to that level, really understand it. A lot of these events, besides losing access to your data, losing access to your systems, or not being able to function as a business, your remediation requires you to go out and touch every single thing in your network at a specific level, in sequence, and then you start figuring out how much data that you lose in the process. And coming back and recovering and saying, let's just go on the small side, right? You have 1,000 users, if 2,000 or 3,000 devices, plus, easy, right? That's a pretty easy ratio. Okay, let's go spend 30 minutes a device times 2,000 to 3,000 devices. And that's what it takes to bring that business back online before you can figure out what your data loss is and where your data recovery point is. And you don't even know what you have as you're going through that process of it's easy to talk about it because we have more,
Yeah, we definitely have
horror stories, plenty of these things. Get back into self-soothing. I'm going to start rocking here. It's scary to talk to companies that haven't been through this, that don't have any experience with it, and try to quantify and say, hey, this is what you really like what you're trying to protect against is, it's oh, it's not hyperbole of you're going to go out of business. It's more of let's say you don't go out of business. What does the action take you to bring your business back online? And what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, we'll wrap it up, right? Because I appreciate the time. I'll say one thing about me and how I ended up here. I wasn't looking for a job. They reached out and said, we feel you'd be a perfect fit for this organization. And I was sitting there at my desk looking at an email from LinkedIn that says you should never turn down an interview. The phone's ringing, right? What the heck? And I listened to them, and I listened to the pitch. Mm-hmm. And the first guy was kind of interesting, the technical guy, when he broke it down for me. I said to myself, nobody else is going to do this for the small, mid-sized organizations at this level. Yeah. So I joined the organization 8.5 years ago, and I'll tell you what.
It's a long run.
I've watched it change already. I've seen the adoption, which is awesome. The branding of MDR, which is great. And the market is just, really just getting started. So I think I made the right choice.
Well, we know MDR is hitting a certain saturation point because now, of course, a lot of other companies are trying to claim that they do it. And now, we've hit a different cycle of like, are you investing with a company that can actually deliver what you think you're buying?
Yeah. Well, the big guys that are traditional product guys are coming in space. That's what's happening.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You got it.